Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you're in a desert sky, endless and full of stars. In the stillness of that ancient night, a man named Jacob wrestled with his fears and with his faith, according to the story, with God himself. And in that struggle, Jacob was given a new name, Israel. From this man came 12 sons. The 12 very different men, each with their own strengths, flaws, and destinies. And from these sons came the 12 tribes of Israel. But now pause for a second and think about that. Not just a family, but the beginnings of a people whose story would ripple across history. Reuben, the firstborn, often passionate, sometimes reckless. Judah, the one whose line, it was said, would give rise to kings. Joseph the dreamer, the one betrayed by his brothers, yet who rose to power in Egypt. And Benjamin, the youngest, fiercely protected by them all. Each son carried the seeds of a tribe. And as their children grew, the family transformed into something bigger, into a nation. But here's the human truth. This wasn't a perfect family. They argued. They betrayed. They loved and forgave. In many ways, they were like any family, messy, complicated, and full of emotions. And yet from them came a shared identity, a covenant with something greater than themselves. Generations later, under Moses, these tribes would march out of Egypt together slaves, tasting freedom for the first time. And they wandered the wilderness side by side, sometimes united, sometimes divided. And when they finally settled in the promised land, each tribe received its own share of land and its own inheritance. Pause. Imagine that 12 tribes spread across the hills and valleys of ancient Israel. 12 brothers, now 12 nations, bound together not just by blood, but by story. It's easy to romanticize them, but reality was harder. These tribes struggled with survival, with faith, with neighbors and enemies. They weren't perfect saints written in stone. They were human, and that's what makes their legacy powerful. Because from the very beginning, the story of the tribes wasn't just about kings or prophets, it was about identity, about belonging, about a people trying to understand who they were and who they were meant to become. And so the 12 tribes stood at the heart of Israel's story, each carrying a piece of the puzzle. Together, they formed the foundation of a nation that would inspire the world, even as history would soon begin to test just how strong that foundation truly was. Stop. Breathe gently. Because what comes next is not unity, but division. And from that division, the legend of the lost tribes would be born. Let's go a little deeper. The story of the tribes isn't just about names written in an old book. It is about people, real people, whose lives carried the weight of history. Take Joseph, for example. A young man with dreams bigger than the fields he worked in. Dreams that even his brothers couldn't understand. And in their jealousy, they sold him into slavery. Imagine that heartbreak your own family. Your blood turning against you? But Joseph's story didn't end there. In Egypt, against all odds, he rose to power, second only to Pharaoh. And when famine struck, it was Joseph who saved not only Egypt, but his family. It's through Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, that two of the great tribes were born. His story reminds us that even in betrayal and suffering, destiny can take root. Then there's Levi. His tribe would never inherit land, but something else: responsibility. The Levites became priests, caretakers of faith, guardians of the temple. Their role was not about power or territory, but about holding the spiritual thread of Israel together. And Judah's line would give rise to King David, and much later to traditions that still echo in both Judaism and Christianity. His tribe wasn't just another branch of the family tree. It carried the promise of kingship and perhaps hope. Stop. Think about the weight of that. These weren't just ordinary families living in tents. Each tribe, each lineage carried stories that would echo across centuries. But let's not lose sight of something important. These were human beings. They argued, they doubted, they made mistakes. Some tribes struggled with faith, others with survival. Yet in their weakness, we see something universal, the struggle to belong, to preserve an identity in a changing world. Now imagine the land itself. Hills, valleys, rivers, the inheritance divided among the tribes. Naphtali settling in the north along the fertile Galilee. Zebulun by the sea, known for trade in ships. Dan near the coast, always vulnerable to invasion. Each tribe had its place, its challenges, its strengths. Together, they formed a fragile unity. But unity, as history shows us, is never easy. Beneath the surface of this family of tribes lay old rivalries, different ambitions, even different gods. And soon, those cracks would widen. For now, though, in this first chapter, what matters is this. The 12 tribes of Israel were more than names. They were more than symbols. They were people who built the foundation of a nation that believed it had been chosen for a purpose. And maybe that's why their story still matters. Because whether you see it through faith or through history or through myth, the story of the tribes is the story of human identity. Who we are, where we come from, and how easily, in the tides of history, we can be scattered. And lost, this is the beginning. The birth of a people. But as every story teaches us, birth is only the first step. What comes after is struggle, glory, and sometimes disappearance. And that's where our journey will lead. Imagine this. The 12 tribes scattered across the hills and valleys of Canaan, living side by side and often restless. Each tribe with its own land, customs, and leaders, and yet something was missing, something enough to hold them all together. For years, the tribes were guided by judges leaders who rose in times of crisis, only to fade back into ordinary life once the danger was over. But the people grew weary. They wanted more. They wanted a king. Stop for a moment. Think about that longing. People who had once been slaves, now asking for a ruler, a crown, a throne. They believed a king would unite them, protect them, give them a place among the great nations of the world. And so the first king was chosen. Saul was a tall, strong man who looked every bit the part of a king. At first, he gave the people what they longed for, a symbol of unity. But power is a heavy burden, and Saul's reign was marked by insecurity, battles won and lost, flashes of greatness, and shadows of doubt. In the end, his story turned tragic, consumed by jealousy and fear. But from Saul's fall came another figure one whose name still echoes across history, David. David is the shepherd boy, the poet, and the warrior who faced Goliath with nothing but a sling and faith. His rise was improbable, yet unstoppable. When he became king, something extraordinary happened. The tribes, once divided, were drawn together. Under David, Israel became more than scattered families. It became a kingdom, a real kingdom with Jerusalem as its beating heart. David captured the city and made it the capital, a place not just of politics, but of worship. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there, making Jerusalem the center of faith and identity. Pause. Imagine the sound of music, the psalms David himself wrote, filling the city, a shepherd's harp now echoing in royal halls. But David was human, too deeply human. His reign carried triumphs, but also scandal, betrayal, and pain. Yet through it all, his leadership bound the tribes tighter than ever before. And then came David's son Solomon. Solomon's reign was unlike anything Israel had seen before. Where David's hands were stained with war, Solomon's were skilled in peace. He built alliances, expanded trade, and filled the kingdom with wealth and learning. Most famously, he built the first temple in Jerusalem. Pause. Picture it. Towering stone walls, golden decorations, a sacred place unlike any before it. For the people of Israel, this was more than architecture, it was proof of permanence, a symbol that their God dwelled among them. Under Solomon, Israel reached its golden age, a kingdom of wisdom, wealth, and stability. Travelers from far and wide came to hear Solomon's judgments, to marvel at his palaces, to witness the splendor of Jerusalem. But golden ages never last forever. Solomon's wisdom, legendary though it was, could not shield him from human weakness. His court grew heavy with luxury, and his alliances brought foreign influences. Slowly, cracks began to appear, resentments among the tribes, discontent with taxes, whispers of rebellion, because here lies the turning point. The tribes that once came together under David and Solomon would soon fracture. The unity, the temple, the glory, it would not hold. But for now, remember this. There was a moment, however brief, when the 12 tribes stood together as one. A kingdom united, a people at their height. A vision of what could have been before history took a darker turn, and Solomon's reign continued. The weight of his choices began to show. The taxes grew heavier, the labor demands harsher. The tribes, once so proud of their king, began to whisper in frustration. They saw the grandeur of his palaces, the splendor of the temple, but they also felt the burden of sustaining it all. Solomon was a man of wisdom, yes, but also of contradiction. He wrote proverbs that spoke of humility, yet his court was filled with gold and ivory. He preached devotion to one God, yet through his marriages to foreign princesses, new altars rose on the hills of Israel, altars to gods the people had never known. Imagine the tension. On one hand, the glory of Israel was unmatched. On the other, a deep fracture was forming, initially invisible, but growing wider with each passing year. The tribes had been united by David's courage and Solomon's vision, but unity born of power is always fragile. And still, the people dreamed. They dreamed that this golden kingdom would last forever, that Jerusalem would never fall, that the temple would stand for eternity. But history does not bend to dreams. When Solomon died, the throne passed to his son, a young man named Rehoboam. He was untested, proud. The people came to him, pleading, "Lighten the heavy yoke your father placed upon us, and we will serve you." But instead of easing their burden, Rehoboam's pride made it heavier. He refused to listen. And in that moment, the fragile unity shattered. 10 of the tribes broke away, rejecting the house of David. They declared their own king, Jeroboam, and the kingdom split in two. Pause for a moment, think about that. Centuries of shared history, shared blood, torn apart in a single decision. North and South, Israel and Judah, brothers turned into rivals. The united kingdom of Israel, so brief, so brilliant, was no more. And the dream of one people under one God, one king, one temple, began to slip into the shadows. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a divided house, a weakened nation. For the 10 tribes of the north, it would set them on a path toward disappearance, toward exile, and toward the mystery of the lost tribes that still lingers today. The kingdom was split into 2 nations. To the south, Judah and Benjamin held fast to Jerusalem, clinging to the temple and the line of David. The north, the other 10 tribes gathered under their new king, Jeroboam, and forged a kingdom of their own, the kingdom of Israel. With division came fear. Jeroboam worried that if his people continued traveling south to worship in Jerusalem, their hearts might turn back to the house of David. So he built new centers of worship altars at Bethel and Dan, with golden calves to stand in place of the sacred ark. He told his people, "These are your gods who brought you out of Egypt." It was meant to unite them, to give them their own identity. But in truth, it planted seeds of betrayal. The prophets railed against it. They warned that turning from the covenant would lead only to ruin. And the northern kingdom persisted, building palaces, raising armies, and carving its own path. Yet beneath the surface, cracks grew deeper. The kings of Israel rose and fell, some lasting only months before being struck down. Assassinations, betrayals, foreign alliances, it was a cycle of instability. Judah to the south had its struggles too, but it held to its temple, its priests, its capital. The north seemed forever restless, like a flame burning too bright, too fast. Stop for a moment and imagine the ordinary people in those days. Farmers tending fields in Ephraim, traders sailing out from the coast of Asher, families in the hills of Naphtali, wondering which king they would serve next. For them, it wasn't about palaces or prophets, it was about survival. Yet slowly, their identity, the very sense of being one family under God, began to fray. The world around them was changing as well. Empires rose on their borders, the Egyptians to the south, the Arameans to the northeast. And beyond them, a storm was gathering in Mesopotamia, the Assyrians. Ruthless, disciplined, unstoppable, they were swallowing nations one by one. Soon, their gaze would turn toward Israel. And while the prophets cried out warning of destruction if the people did not turn back, the kings ignored them. Wars broke out between north and south, brothers fighting against brothers, even as the shadow of Assyria crept closer. This is the time when the story takes a darker turn. The unity once dreamed of under David and Solomon was gone, and the tribes stood divided, vulnerable, and unprepared for what was coming. The stage was set for conquest, exile, and disappearance, and when that storm finally struck, it would sweep the 10 tribes into history's shadows, where they remain to this day half remembered, half forgotten, waiting to be found. The winds of Assyria grew louder with each passing year. Their armies marched like thunder across the Fertile Crescent. Iron weapons cutting through kingdoms that once considered themselves secure. City after city fell, until only a handful of nations remained standing. Among those trembling before the storm was the northern kingdom of Israel. The people must have felt the unease in the air, heard the whispers of battles far to the east, and sensed the rumors of armies moving closer. The prophets shouted their warnings in the streets. Turn back, repent, return to the covenant. But the kings were stubborn, and the people grew numb to fear when it lingered too long. Life went on, until one day it did not. The Assyrian armies finally came. The soldiers were relentless, their tactics brutal. But they did not just conquer, they dismantled. They tore down walls, burned cities, and uprooted entire populations. It was not enough to win battles. They sought to erase nations, to scatter people so thoroughly that they could never rise again. Imagine the panic as villages burned. Families fled with what little they could carry. Children cried as soldiers marched them away. Whole communities, bound together for centuries, were torn from their land, chained, and marched into exile. And here lies the tragedy. The 10 tribes, the house of Israel, were scattered across the Assyrian Empire. Resettled among foreign lands, swallowed by strangers, they did not vanish in a single day. Their names remained Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali, but their identities faded. Piece by piece, memory by memory, the tribes dissolved into the world around them. Judah to the south watched with dread. They too would face exile one day, but their story would be different. Judah would remember, rebuild, and return. The north would not. The 10 tribes slipped into silence, into mystery. And so the phrase was born, the lost tribes of Israel. Not because they were destroyed completely, but because their trail was swallowed by history. Their voices went quiet. Their descendants, if they lived on, melted into other peoples. The world forgot where they had gone. Stop for a moment. Think about the weight of that loss. 10 out of 12 tribes gone from the record. A family once whole, now broken. Their stories unfinished. Their names left hanging in the air. This was not just the fall of a kingdom, it was the beginning of one of history's greatest mysteries. Where did they go? What became of them? Did they vanish forever? Or do their descendants still walk among us, unaware of who they truly are? The answers would echo across centuries. Legends began to rise, whispers of lost tribes found in distant lands, tales of migration, survival, and hidden identity. But before we chase those legends, we must sit for a moment in this silence, the silence of a people scattered, a silence that has haunted history ever since. The dust of exile did not settle quickly. Imagine the northern hills of Israel, once alive with farms, songs, and children running through fields, the air now heavy with smoke and silence. The Assyrians had arrived like a storm. Their armies crushed resistance with ease. Their reputation alone was enough to terrify nations, but their methods left a wound in history. The Assyrians believed in something called deportation policy. To them, conquering a land was not just about planting a flag, it was about erasing identity. They uprooted entire communities and moved them far from their homes, scattering them like seeds in foreign soil. In their place they brought strangers, different peoples, languages, and gods. It was a deliberate strategy. Confuse, mix, dissolve. And so it happened to Israel. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, and the 10 tribes were led away chained, hungry, forced to walk to lands they had never seen. Some to the mountains of Media, others to the plains of Mesopotamia. Places with strange tongues, unfamiliar customs, alien gods. But what happens to a people when they are pulled out of their roots? At first, they resist. They cling to their traditions, their language, their faith. But over time, in strange lands, those bonds weaken. Children grow up speaking a new tongue. Marriages bind them to foreign neighbors. Memories fade. This was the fate of the 10 tribes. They were not annihilated in one blow. They were slowly absorbed. They became part of other nations. Their names lost in the tide of history. The Bible falls silent about them after this moment. And that silence is louder than words. Now think of Judah, the southern kingdom. They watched this with horror. They were spared for the moment, but they understood the warning. Exile destroys more than walls and palaces, it destroys memory. Judah would one day fall too, carried off by Babylon. But unlike the north, Judah's exiles clung desperately to identity. They preserved the Torah, the stories, the rituals. That is why today we know the word Jew from Judah. But what of Israel's 10 tribes? Gone. At least that's how it seems. The silence never stays empty for long. Where history leaves a gap, legend begins to grow. Over the centuries, people wondered, where did the 10 tribes go? Were they truly gone forever, or had they survived in secret, scattered across the world? Some said they wandered east toward Persia, India, even as far as China. Others whispered that they crossed mountains, deserts, oceans, that they were hidden at the edge of the earth, waiting to return. Pause here, and think about the human heart. When something precious is lost, we cannot accept the finality of disappearance. We search, we imagine, we create stories. And so the lost tribes became not just a historical question, but a mystery that touched faith, hope, and longing. The Assyrians believed they had erased Israel. But perhaps the story was only beginning. The march into exile must have felt endless. Step by step, dust rising beneath broken sandals, children stumbling in the heat, elders dragged forward by soldiers who did not care if they lived or fell. Imagine the mothers clutching their infants, whispering lullabies even when belief faltered, while fathers kept silent, staring into the horizon, powerless. This was not just war, it was the unmaking of a people. When they finally reached the lands of Assyria and Media, there was no welcome, no kindness. They were strangers among strangers. They were made to farm fields that were not theirs, to bow before kings they did not choose, to hear prayers to gods they did not know. Their own God felt distant, silent. Had he abandoned them? Or was this exile their punishment, just as the prophets had warned? And here's where the tragedy deepens. For a time they must have resisted. Some families surely whispered their songs of Zion, lit fires on holy days, tried to tell their children who they were and where they had come from. But what happens when those children grow? When are the words of their fathers drowned out by the voices of their neighbors? Slowly their speech shifted. Their names changed. Their prayers grew fewer. A generation passed, then another, until their distinctiveness began to blur. It is painful to admit, but it is the truth. The tribes did not fall with swords in their hands. They faded in silence and forgetting. The northern kingdom of Israel became not a memory of land and kings, but a mystery of bloodlines scattered in every direction. And yet silence has power, because it does not close a story, it opens it. The Assyrians thought they had erased the 10 tribes, but in erasing them from history, they unknowingly gave birth to one of the greatest enigmas mankind has ever carried. Where did they go? Were they swallowed entirely, lost to the river of nations? Or do their descendants still walk among us, unaware of the inheritance carried in their veins? The questions have haunted prophets, kings, rabbis, priests, and explorers for centuries. Some swore they had found traces of the tribes in the farthest corners of the earth, while others believed they never disappeared at all, only hidden until the day they would return. The truth, buried under centuries of dust, still waits. But you see, mystery has a way of surviving longer than facts. The Assyrian records tell us who was conquered, where they were sent, and even how they were scattered, but then silence. The trail simply vanishes. No more names, no more songs, no more lines carved in stone. And for the world, silence became possibility. Think about it when people disappear from history. They don't just vanish, they invite questions. And questions invite imagination. Rabbis whispered of their brothers in lands beyond rivers no one had crossed. Priests in Europe told travelers that the lost tribes might be hidden at the edges of the earth, awaiting the day of return. Explorers set out not just for gold or new lands, but with the secret hope of finding fragments of Israel in unexpected faces. Generations of longing turned exile into legend, and legend became prophecy. Some believed that when the lost tribes returned, the world itself would change. Their reappearance would signal redemption, even the coming of a messianic age. And so each rumor mattered. A strange custom here, a familiar word there, a community praying to a single invisible god in the mountains of Africa or Asia. It all ignited the imagination. Could this be them? Could this be the echo of a people who refused to disappear completely? But for now, in those early centuries, the 10 tribes remained more absence than presence, more question than answer. They had been scattered by empire, and in that scattering, they slipped into the cracks of history. Yet, history is never finished, and the human heart refuses to let go of mystery. Centuries passed, but the silence of the lost tribes became almost unbearable. The people longed to know, where had their brothers gone? Were they living as strangers in distant kingdoms? Had they vanished forever into the tide of history? And so the search began. not always with maps or armies, but with stories, whispers, and journeys into the unknown. Some of the first clues seem to come from Africa. Far in the highlands of Ethiopia lived a people who kept strange, ancient customs, avoiding certain foods, observing rituals that reminded visitors of the laws of Moses. They called themselves Beta Israel, and they believed they were children of the tribe of Dan. Imagine the shock of a Jewish traveler meeting them for the first time. After generations of believing the 10 tribes had been erased, here were men and women praying to the God of Abraham, clinging to a memory that had survived through exile and time. But Ethiopia was not the only place. In the hills of southern Africa, the Lemba told stories of ancestors who had journeyed across seas from a faraway land. They spoke of sacred objects, of rituals strangely reminiscent of Israel. Their elders even carried a word, Buba, their priestly clan, that echoed ancient names from the house of Levi. Was it coincidence? Or a thread of truth stretching back to the lost tribes? And then there was Nigeria. Among the Igbo people, stories of descent from Israel ran deep. Families claimed ties to the tribes of Ephraim, Naphtali, Manasseh, Levi, Zebulun, and Gad. Their songs, customs, even the way they marked time carried echoes of something older, something familiar. But could memory alone prove identity? Or was it faith keeping alive what history had let fade? Every discovery, every rumor, every similarity sparked debates that have lasted centuries. Some historians dismissed it all as coincidence, cultures developing similar practices by chance. But others leaned forward because for those who believed, these were not coincidences. These were the first flickers of a fire that had never truly gone out. Africa was just the beginning. Beyond deserts, mountains, and oceans, the whispers of the lost tribes began to appear in the unlikeless corners of the world. They carried further east, across deserts and mountains, into Asia, a place where the imagination of the lost tribes took on new life. In the lush hills of northeast India, there lived a community who called themselves the Baymanesh. Their elders told a story that sounds like scripture. They were the children of Manasseh, one of the 10 tribes carried away by the Assyrians. For centuries, they had preserved fragments of memory, songs and customs, memories of crossing rivers, wandering through lands that were not their own, always seeking a home. When outsiders first heard these stories, they didn't know what to think. Were these echoes of truth, or faith passed down so long it became history itself? And yet, in 2005, Israel's chief rabbi looked at them and declared, "Yes, you are children of Israel. You may come home if you return fully to the faith." Imagine the emotion in that moment. A community cut off for over 2,000 years suddenly told the exile was ending. Perhaps the most fascinating claims came from the rugged mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan among the Pashtuns. For generations, many Pashtun tribes believed they were sons of Israel. Their names, like Yusuf Zai, sons of Joseph, carried the weight of that claim. From circumcision to laws of purity, they reminded visitors of the Torah. Could it be? Could these fierce mountain tribes be the long-lost children of Jacob? Some genetic studies hinted at connections, but nothing was ever conclusive. And so the debate continues. Are they Israel? Or are they something entirely their own? And then, in the farthest reaches of the East, came a theory almost too bold to believe. Some writers in the 19th and 20th centuries looked to Japan and saw Israel. They pointed to ancient rituals, similarities in words, and the Japanese reverence for purity and tradition. But had the tribes really traveled that far? Historians often dismiss the idea as romantic, yet it shows how far people are willing to stretch the threads of possibility across the world. Each of these stories, India, Afghanistan, Japan, whether truth or myth, carries the same heartbeat. Exile was not the end. Identity might bend, but it never fully breaks. Somewhere, scattered like stars, the children of Jacob still walked the earth. And if Asia held such echoes, then surely the searchers thought, what about the lands beyond the great seas? Could the story of the lost tribes stretch even farther, to places no Israelite could have dreamed of? From the east, the searchers turned their eyes back toward Europe. In the heart of Christendom, whispers of the tribes had taken on an entirely different shape. In the 19th century, a strange idea began to spread, one that came to be known as British Israelism. Its followers believed that the peoples of Britain, and even broader northwestern Europe, were the true heirs of the lost tribes. They saw hidden codes in scripture, linguistic parallels between Hebrew and English, even prophecies pointing to the British throne. The empire on which the sun never set was not just political power, it was biblical destiny fulfilled. But historians and scholars would roll their eyes. They called it pseudo-archaeology, a fantasy built on wishful thinking rather than evidence. And yet millions believed it. Because once again, you see, it wasn't only about facts, it was about belonging, about identity, about the hunger to connect oneself to a story greater than time itself. And then, across the vast Atlantic, another frontier of possibility opened, the Americas. From the moment Europeans set foot in the New World, missionaries and explorers looked at the faces of the Native Americans and asked, could these be the lost tribes? Think of it, men who had sailed across oceans suddenly confronted peoples they had never imagined. They saw customs they didn't understand, heard languages that rang unfamiliar, and in their desperate need to explain, some turned to the mystery of Israel. Perhaps these were the children of Jacob, carried farther than anyone could have dreamed. For the Latter-day Saints, the question was not a mere curiosity, it became part of their scripture. The Book of Mormon told of ancient Israelite families who, around 600 BCE, crossed the seas and became ancestors of some indigenous peoples of the Americas. To believers, this was not speculation but divine record. To others, it became another chapter of the same old mystery desire, faith, an identification woven into stories of migration and loss. So, from Ethiopia to Zimbabwe, from India to Afghanistan, and from Britain to the mountains of the United States, the lost tribes lived on no longer as one people in one place, but as 1,000 claims scattered like sparks across the earth. Every tradition that touched the tale reshaped it, made it their own, breathed new life into it. The question still remains, were these sparks the dying embers of a fire long extinguished? Or evidence that the flame never went out at all? And now, after chasing trails across continents, we must ask the hardest question of all. What if the tribes never traveled to the ends of the earth? What if they never became hidden nations waiting to be revealed? What if the truth is far simpler and far sadder? History, after all, is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, merciless in its silence. The Assyrian Empire had a policy, a brutal, effective strategy. When they conquered a people, they scattered them. Families were torn apart, villages uprooted, identities broken down until memory itself began to dissolve. And once scattered, assimilation became almost inevitable. Think of it. Children growing up surrounded by foreign tongues, foreign gods, foreign traditions. A boy who once heard the name Jacob now answers to a name in Akkadian. A girl who once lit candles for the God of Israel now sings songs to Ishtar because her neighbors do. One generation passes into another, and the fragile thread of identity snaps not by war, not by force, but by forgetting. Archaeologists and historians point to this as the most likely outcome, that the 10 tribes, once exiled, simply blended into the fabric of the empire. They became Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, until no one could tell them apart. Lost not because they were hidden, but because they became everyone. And yet, that is not the whole story. Because even in the land of Israel, not all were taken. The Samaritans, an ancient community who still live today, claim they are the descendants of these northern Israelites who survived the conquest. They kept their own Torah, their personal temple traditions, and though their numbers faded, their claim stands. We are Israel. We never disappeared. So here we are, standing between two truths. On one side, the historian's truth. The tribes were assimilated, erased by empire. On the other, the believer's truth, that God's people cannot vanish, that somewhere they endure, awaiting the day of return, and maybe, just maybe, both truths hold a fragment of the answer. For while history may have swallowed their names, the legend of the tribes has never died. It has lived on in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in America, not as proof, but as faith. A faith so sturdy it refuses to let silence have the last word. And perhaps this is why the story of the lost tribes matters, not because of where they went, but because of what their absence has done. It has kept alive the longing for reunion, for restoration, for a return to something whole. The world still waits. And some say when the waiting ends, history itself will change forever. But let us sit with this for a moment, because behind the debate assimilation or preservation lies something even more human, the fear of being forgotten. Isn't that what we all dread? That after we are gone, after our names are spoken for the last time, the story of who we were will fade into silence? The 10 tribes, whether they survived as distinct peoples or not, have become the symbol of that fear. They became the question, what happens when an entire nation disappears? Some say the silence proves they were swallowed whole, but others insist silence is not the same as death. In the Jewish tradition, memory is sacred. To remember is to keep alive. And so, the lost tribes became not just a puzzle of history, but a test of faith. Imagine a father, 2,000 years ago, telling his child, "Our brothers are out there. One day they will return." He cannot prove it. He cannot show where, but he believes it. And belief is enough to carry hope across centuries. That hope became part of Jewish prayers, part of the rhythm of exile itself. A world fractured could still be made whole, because somewhere the missing pieces still existed. And here's the irony. Even if the historians are right, even if the tribes truly did assimilate into the empires around them, the legend itself preserved them in another way. Not in blood, but in spirit. In the longing of millions who refuse to let the story die. So we find ourselves caught between history and hope. On one side, the ruins and records of Assyria, telling us identities dissolve. On the other side, the human heart, whispering that no one is ever lost forever. And maybe that is why this story still matters. Not because we will ever solve the riddle with certainty, but because the lost tribes have become a mirror for us all. They ask us, what will endure when your time is gone? What part of you will survive in memory, in story, in faith? And in that way, the lost tribes are not lost at all. They are still here hidden in our questions, alive in our imagination, carried on in the faith of those who still wait for their return. For centuries, the silence of the lost tribes was not seen as the end of their story. No, for many, it was only the beginning. Because in the hearts of prophets, mystics, and dreamers, their disappearance was never an accident, it was part of a greater plan. In Jewish tradition, the tribes were not just people. They were a promise. The Bible spoke of a day when all 12 would once again stand together, reunited in their land, whole as they had been in the days of David and Solomon. Their exile then was not permanent. It was a pause. And their return one day would not be ordinary history, but a sign that redemption itself was near. Listen to the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They all speak of scattered children, gathered from the four corners of the earth. And the Psalms sing of exiles restored, like streams returning to the desert. In those words, the lost tribes aren't forgotten. They may be hidden, waiting for their appointed hour. And so, over centuries, hope began to take form as prophecy. Rabbis taught that when the Messiah came, he would not come for Judah alone, but for all of Israel, for Benjamin, for Levi, and for the 10 tribes who vanished into history's shadows. Their return would mean the world was being mended, the story of exile closing, and the story of eternity beginning. But it wasn't only in Jewish thought. Christian writers too became fascinated. To them, the return of the tribes was a sign of the second coming. Missionaries in faraway lands often searched for Israel among the people they met, because to find them meant prophecy was unfolding before their very eyes. Imagine the excitement, the urgency, every discovery of a strange custom, every rumor of a tribe praying to one god. It wasn't just anthropology, it was destiny. And so the lost tribes left the realm of history and entered the realm of hope. They became symbols not only of what was missing, but of what was promised. Every exile, every scattered people could look at their story and say, if Israel will be gathered again, then perhaps so will we. Of course, prophecy and history do not always walk hand in hand, but sometimes it is not about proof. It is about belief strong enough to carry generations through darkness. And belief in the return of the lost tribes was exactly that. A torch passed down, burning through centuries of waiting. The question was no longer just, where are they? It became, when will they come back? And what will it mean when they do? Think about this. Exile doesn't always mean chains. Sometimes exile means blending in so well, you forget you were ever one of a kind. Imagine a young Israelite boy taken into Assyria. He grows up playing games in the streets of Nineveh, eating foods his ancestors never touched, speaking a tongue his grandparents barely understood. To him, the songs of Zion are bedtime stories, not living memory. When he grows older, marries, and has children, what language will he teach them? What festivals will he celebrate? Slowly, without noticing, the thread of his heritage slips through his fingers. That is assimilation. It is not sudden, it is gentle, slow, and merciless. Like ink fading from a page until the letters are gone, but the paper remains. This is what most historians believe happened to the 10 tribes. They did not vanish overnight. They dissolved, like salt in water, leaving behind no clear trace. And yet listen, close to human identity is stubborn. Even when names are forgotten, even when customs fade, something lingers. A story here, a ritual there, a word that doesn't quite belong to the dominant culture. These small remnants sometimes survive like embers, refusing to go out completely. Centuries later, those embers can burst into flame again, as we've seen in communities claiming descent from the tribes. The Samaritans stand as living proof of this. They survived while kingdoms fell, while empires rose and crumbled. They carried their own Torah, their own priesthood, and their own holy mountain. They said, "We are not lost, we are here." To this day, they still gather on Mount Gerizim, performing ancient rituals older than Rome, older than Christianity, older than Islam. They are a reminder that even in the storm of assimilation, survival is possible. So we ask, was it total erasure or partial survival? Were the 10 tribes completely absorbed, or do their fragments still walk among us in ways we cannot yet see? Maybe the answer is not either or. Perhaps some lines disappeared forever, while others endured quietly, waiting for their story to be rediscovered. But what matters is this. The story of the lost tribes is less about proving their DNA, and more about what their absence awakened in us. They became the symbol of resilience, longing, and the human refusal to accept that our people, our families, our histories can simply vanish. And in that sense, even if the 10 tribes were lost in body, they were never lost in spirit. The memory of them survived because people refused to let them go. Imagine this, a people scattered, broken, cut off from their land. By every measure of history, they should have been forgotten. Another lost chapter in the endless march of empires. But here's the extraordinary part, their story didn't end in silence. It began to echo in prophecy. The prophets of Israel looked at the ruin, the deportations, the empty fields where children once played, and instead of saying, "It is over," they whispered something almost impossible. They will return. Take Hosea, for instance. He spoke of Israel as a faithless spouse, cast away for her unfaithfulness, but then promised reconciliation. He declared that though God had said, "You are not my people," one day he would say again, "You are the children of the living God." Can you imagine hearing that while standing in exile, believing your name had been erased? Suddenly you're told, no, it's not finished. You are not gone. Then there's Isaiah. He painted visions of scattered exiles streaming back from the north, the west, even from the ends of the earth. His words weren't dry predictions. They were songs of hope sung into despair. To people who thought they had no future, he gave a picture of highways cutting across deserts, carrying their children home. And Ezekiel. He took it further, seeing the house of Israel like a valley of dry bones, lifeless, forgotten. But in his vision, the bones rattled, came together, grew flesh, and were breathed into life again. What a metaphor. The message was simple. Even if you feel like nothing but dust, you will rise again. These prophecies turn the narrative upside down. Instead of being remembered only as a tragedy, the lost tribes became a promise, a hope tied into the very heart of Israel's destiny. Their disappearance was no longer just a loss. It was transformed into waiting, in expectation that one day the story would resume. And that's why, centuries later, whenever new lands were discovered, whenever strange peoples were encountered, the question would rise, could this be them? The prophecies made people believe the tribes weren't gone, just hidden, but waiting to return. Hope is powerful. It kept their memory alive through exile, conquest, and centuries of silence. Hope made absence into presence and loss into possibility. Hope doesn't stay quiet. Once planted, it grows into stories, and stories, they travel. The idea that the 10 tribes were not destroyed but hidden, preserved somewhere far away, became one of the most enduring legends of Jewish and Christian imagination. Imagine you are a medieval traveler, setting out across deserts or boarding a creaking ship into unknown waters. The world was still full of blank spaces on maps, lands unexplored, kingdoms unseen. And in those wide gaps, prophecy breathed life. Maybe the 10 tribes were out there, somewhere beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, beyond the mountains of Asia, across oceans no one had yet crossed. By the Middle Ages, rumors of the lost tribes had spread into every corner of storytelling. In Jewish legend, they were sometimes said to live across the legendary river Sambation, a river that raged with stones and fire 6 days of the week, resting only on the Sabbath. No traveler could cross it, but it was said the tribes thrived on the other side, faithful, waiting for the moment of return. Christian Europe picked up the story too. Crusaders marching toward the Holy Land whispered of powerful Jewish kingdoms beyond the horizon, perhaps allies who might one day join the battle. Explorers told tales of encountering peoples in Asia or Africa who kept customs oddly familiar. Were they remnants of Israel? And then came the legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian king said to rule a vast hidden kingdom somewhere in the East or maybe in Africa, depending on who told the tale. Some versions of the story tied his kingdom to the lost tribes, as if ancient promises and medieval longing had merged into one dream. Silk Road traders carried whispers too. Stories moved faster than caravans. A merchant might tell of a tribe beyond Persia who practiced laws that looked strangely biblical. Another insisted he had seen communities claiming descent from ancient Israelites. Were these echoes of the 10 tribes, or the human tendency to weave prophecy into whatever we cannot explain? This was the power of prophecy. It gave people eyes to see not just what was, but what might be. For Jews scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, these tales were more than fantasy. They were lifelines of hope. They meant that exile was not total. Somewhere out there, their brothers and sisters were still keeping the covenant alive, waiting for reunion. Even in Christian thought, the idea of the lost tribes became bound up with apocalyptic visions, the belief that at the end of time, when the world was renewed, they would return. Their absence wasn't a failure of history, but part of a divine script still unfolding. So prophecy did what empires could not. It kept the tribes alive. Not in flesh, perhaps, but in imagination. And imagination is powerful. It shapes how people travel, how they explore, how they search for meaning across oceans and centuries. By the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, the world was opening up in ways no one could have imagined. Maps were no longer blank in just patches. They were being filled in with coastlines, mountain ranges, and the names of new peoples Europeans were meeting for the first time. In those first encounters, the old legend of the lost tribes returned with force. Consider a Spanish friar stepping off a ship in the Caribbean. The local people greet him, speaking a language he does not recognize, performing rituals he has never seen. Instead of noting the difference, his thoughts turn to prophecy, to history. Could these people be Israel? Could the 10 lost tribes have traveled across oceans, building civilizations in lands unknown to Europe? This wasn't idle wondering, it shaped exploration itself. As Europeans expanded into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, reports of the lost tribes kept surfacing in travel accounts. Missionaries wrote back to Europe, swearing that the customs of Native Americans echoed biblical traditions. Some claimed to see remnants of circumcision, dietary laws, even echoes of the Hebrew tongue hidden in native languages. Were they stretching the truth? Almost certainly. But remember, the legend wasn't just about facts. It was about hope. And explorers, missionaries, and kings were eager to believe that prophecy could be confirmed in the new lands they were discovering. In Africa, the story found new life. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia, already claiming descent from the tribe of Dan, became objects of fascination for European travelers. They were seen not just as a Jewish community, but as living proof that the 10 tribes had not been lost at all. Their very existence kept the imagination burning. Meanwhile, in Asia, Jesuit missionaries arriving in India and China carried back tales of strange groups who claimed ancient Israelite heritage. In northeast India, much later, the communities now called the Bay-Manash kept traditions that Europeans quickly interpreted through the lens of the lost tribes. In Afghanistan and Persia, the Pashtun tribes' proud warrior peoples were said to bear the names of Joseph, Israel, and other biblical figures. The whispers never died. And then the Americas. Nowhere did the story grip more tightly than here. In the 17th century, Puritan settlers in New England began writing sermons claiming that Native Americans might be the scattered Israelites. To them, this wasn't just speculation, it was theology. If the tribes were in the New World, then history itself was being rewritten before their very eyes. Centuries later, the Book of Mormon would take this idea further, weaving it into new scripture that claimed Israelite. Families had traveled across the seas and become ancestors of some native peoples. What's striking is how this search never faded with time. Explorers, merchants, missionaries, they all kept the lost tribes in their pocket, so to speak, ready to explain whatever new culture or custom they didn't understand. It was easier, in some ways, to believe in prophecy than to accept the unfamiliar as truly different. But behind all of this, the colonial ambitions, the missionary zeal, the pseudo-history was the same thread that had always kept the legend alive, the belief that exile was not final. That scattered does not mean destroyed. That what was broken might one day be gathered again. And so, as ships crossed oceans and maps filled with ink, the tribes of Israel lived on not in the truth of discovery, but in the restless human urge to connect the present to a sacred past. But of course, because the explorers searched, priests wrote letters home, and kings funded expeditions, there was usually that lingering question: had this search become about discovery or about projection? Take the Jesuits in China, for example. They encountered communities whose rituals looked vaguely like dietary laws, whose symbols carried a rhythm they thought familiar. And instead of saying, "This is different," many wrote, this must be Israel." They weren't just observing the people before them, they were staring through the lens of prophecy, determined to fit the world into a story they already believed. In Africa, the same pattern appeared. Travelers described the Lemba in southern Africa, with strict rules about food and marriage and an oral tradition of coming from across the sea. The similarities to Jewish law struck observers like lightning. Surely, they said, this is a remnant of Israel. And when modern genetic studies centuries later revealed traces of Middle Eastern ancestry among the Lemba, the priestly line, it only deepened the mystery. Proof? Maybe. Suggestion? Definitely. Enough to keep the imagination alive? Without question. And then there was the New World, the place where hope and myth exploded together. To the Puritans in North America, the idea that the tribes of Israel were hidden among Native Americans gave meaning to their mission. It wasn't just colonization. In their minds, it was prophecy unfolding. They weren't erasing cultures, they were restoring them. It was a dangerous belief, one that cloaked conquest in the language of sacred destiny. Pause for a moment. Imagine what it meant for a Jewish community in Amsterdam, Prague, or Cairo to hear these stories. To sit by candlelight, listening to a traveler describe a people in Ethiopia who kept the Sabbath, or to read a pamphlet claiming that across the ocean the children of Israel lived on. Can you feel that spark of hope? That maybe exile wasn't the final word? That someday a knock might come at the door, not from an enemy, but from a long-lost brother? This is why the legend survived. Not because explorers could ever truly prove it, but because for centuries, people needed it to be true. The age of exploration, with all its brutality and wonder, did something unexpected. It didn't just discover a continent, it gave the world new room for old stories. Every mountain range, every river, every new tribe encountered could become the setting for the 10 lost tribes. They were always just over the horizon, always one step beyond the edge of the known. And that is the paradox. The lost tribes never had to be found to shape history. The search for them was enough to keep faith alive, to fuel colonial missions. to justify empires, and to weave hope into exile. The 18th and 19th centuries arrived with a new spirit. The Enlightenment swept across Europe, carrying a thirst for reason, evidence, and clarity. The old ways of seeing the world through prophecy, myth, and imagination were now tested against archaeology, philology, and the emerging science of history, and so the story of the 10 lost tribes found itself on trial. For centuries, people had pointed at faraway lands and strange customs, declaring, here are the children of Israel. But Enlightenment scholars began asking harder questions. Where were the records? Where were the inscriptions? Where was the proof that these scattered communities truly descended from ancient Israel, rather than resembling them by coincidence or through the universal echoes of human culture? This wasn't cynicism, it was method. For the first time, historians traced the Assyrian conquest with archaeological precision. Cuneiform tablets, unearthed from palaces in Nineveh, told the story from the other side. They confirmed the mass deportations of Israelites, scattering them across Mesopotamia, but also painted a sobering picture. Deported peoples rarely remained distinct forever. They blended, intermarried, and vanished into the larger fabric of empire. To the rational mind, the fate of the 10 tribes was no longer a mystery. They had been absorbed, swallowed by time. But humans are not made of reason alone. Even as scholarship dismantled the legends, the yearning for lost brothers and hidden kingdoms did not die. Jewish communities, still scattered, facing persecution, held tight to the dream that somewhere far away, remnants of the tribes endured. For Christians, belief remained bound to apocalyptic expectation. The return of the 10 tribes was not just history, it was destiny. Yet the Enlightenment sharpened the line between faith and evidence. Figures like Sir William Jones in India or explorers of Central Asia might hear local claims of Israelite descent, but now they asked, could this be proven linguistically, genetically, culturally? Was this history or wishful thinking? And yet, just as the Enlightenment dismissed old legends, new movements rose to replace them. The 19th century gave birth to British Israelism, the strange belief that the true descendants of the lost tribes were not in Ethiopia or Asia at all, but in Britain itself. Proponents twisted scripture, linguistics, and racial theory to argue that Anglo-Saxons were Israel reborn. It was pseudo-archaeology, pseudo-history, but it revealed how persistent the hunger was to connect one's own story to the sacred past. Meanwhile, Jewish thinkers of the same era began reframing the legend. For them, the lost tribes became less about geography and more about hope. The Enlightenment had opened new doors: emancipation, citizenship, participation in modern states. But it also raised a terrifying question: how do you remain Jewish in a world that demands assimilation? The lost tribes became a mirror. Their story warned of what could happen when identity dissolves, but also held the dream that even assimilation could not erase the covenant forever. And so, in this age of reason, the lost tribes were not quite found, but they were reinterpreted. No longer just a matter of maps and rivers, but a symbol of endurance, memory, and the tension between vanishing and surviving. History had spoken. Archaeology had spoken, and yet prophecy still whispered. Think of the tension of that era. On one side, the cold, precise scalpel of reason carving away at legend. On the other, the warm heartbeat of prophecy refusing to let go. It wasn't simply a debate about history, it was a debate about how human beings see the world. Scholars in London, Paris, and Berlin, sitting in rooms stacked with books and artifacts, wanted evidence. They pored over Assyrian records, Greek accounts, biblical texts. They traced deportations on maps, counted populations, studied languages. Their conclusion was pragmatic, even blunt. The tribes didn't survive as distinct peoples. They became part of the Assyrian Empire, absorbed into Babylon, Persia, later into the endless shifting sands of history. But outside those candlelit studies in synagogues and churches, the whispers never stopped. Jewish storytellers still spoke of the river Sambation, that mystical torrent that raged with stones 6 days a week and rested only on the Sabbath, guarding the tribes beyond. Christian preachers, especially in revivalist movements, pointed to the lost tribes as a piece of the apocalyptic puzzle proof that the end of days would come, when they would return and the world would be renewed. So, while reason wrote one script, faith wrote another. The age of colonialism, with its fascination for discovering new peoples, gave this faith plenty of fuel. Reports from missionaries in India, Ethiopia, or the Americas weren't dismissed. They were devoured by ordinary believers hungry for signs that prophecy still lived. The Enlightenment could not erase that. Even within Jewish thought, the legend carried weight. Rabbis debated it not as a question of maps, but of meaning. Were the tribes lost forever, or preserved for a time yet to come? Some insisted that the Messiah himself could not arrive until the 10. Tribes returned that their absence was not just historical, but spiritual, an unfinished chapter in God's book. The rise of modern nationalism in the 19th century added a new layer. Nations across Europe dug through history to define themselves. Britain gave the legend a peculiar twist. British Israelism claimed that the Anglo-Saxon peoples were themselves the lost tribes, heirs to biblical prophecy. The audacity was breathtaking, transforming a myth about exile into a declaration of destiny. It was pseudo-history, yes, but it fed imperial pride, convincing many that Britain's global reach was not just power, it was fulfillment. Meanwhile, archaeology advanced. Explorers' spades dug into Mesopotamia, uncovering clay tablets from Assyria and Babylon. The deportations of Israel had a voice, a date, even a logistics plan. They confirmed the scattering, but offered no evidence of preservation. Science seemed to side with skepticism, and yet the mystery did not die. It never does. Because the story of the lost tribes ain't just about where people went, it's about what people need. A people in exile needed to believe that exile wasn't final. A world facing change needed to believe that history had hidden threads yet to be revealed. The lost tribes lived there, not because archaeology proved them, but because imagination required them. That is the paradox of the Enlightenment. It gave us facts. It could not take away longing. The 20th century arrived with both devastation and rebirth. For the Jewish people, it was the century of the Holocaust and the rebirth of the nation of Israel, a century where exile and return were lived realities. Into that storm, the legend of the 10 lost tribes was reshaped and reborn. This time, it wasn't explorers with compasses or missionaries with Bibles leading the search. It was scholars, anthropologists, geneticists. The tools had changed. Instead of prophecy, there were microscopes. Instead of whispered tales, there were DNA samples, linguistic charts, anthropological studies. But the question remained the same as it had been for 2,700 years. Where did they go? And in some places, answers began to emerge. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia preserved their traditions for centuries' Sabbath observance. Dietary laws, stories of descent from the tribe of Dan. Many Jews in Europe had doubted them, dismissed them. But in 1973, Israel's chief Sephardic rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, ruled that they were indeed of Jewish descent. The prophecy had, in a way, become reality. In the 1980s and 1990s, Operation Moses and Operation Solomon airlifted tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. For the first time in millennia, descendants of a community long thought connected to the lost tribes returned to their ancestral land. In India, the Bani Manasseh of Manipur and Mizoram claim descent from the tribe of Manasseh. Their songs, oral traditions, and yearning for Jerusalem speak of ancient ties. In 2005, Israel's chief rabbinate recognized them as part of the lost tribes, though formal conversion was required. Today, many continue to migrate to Israel, carrying their story into the modern Jewish world. In southern Africa, the Lemba people drew intense scholarly attention. Their oral traditions spoke of crossing the sea from a place called Senna, possibly Yemen. Their dietary laws mirrored kashrut. Genetic testing of their priestly clan revealed a high percentage carrying the Cohen modal haplotype associated with Jewish priestly descent. Proof of lost tribes? Perhaps not, but undeniable evidence of ancient Jewish links. Yet the modern age complicates mysteries as much as it resolves them. The Igbo of Nigeria claim descent from Israel, but scholars debate fiercely. The Pashtuns of Afghanistan and Pakistan tell stories of being Bani Israel, children of Israel. Science has yet to confirm it. The Japanese Jewish common ancestry theory lingers on the fringes. British Israelism, once booming, is now largely a cautionary tale. But whether proven or not, these claims matter. They resonate because the story of the lost tribes is not just about geography, it's about identity, dignity, and connection to a story larger than oneself. In Israel, the legend has transformed from myth into policy. The state must decide who is in, who is out, who belongs to the Great Return, and who remains on the margins. The lost tribes are no longer just ancient history. They are modern politics, immigration, and the boundaries of Jewish identity. Science continues to dig deeper. Genetics traces migration patterns. Archaeology uncovers the Assyrian exile. Linguists unravel threads hidden in song and ritual. The past becomes clearer, yet the mystery never fully dissolves. Perhaps, after all, the 10 tribes were never just about history. They were always about something greater, the human refusal to accept that loss is final, that exile is forever, that identity can vanish into dust. In the 21st century, the lost tribes live on, not only in Afghanistan's deserts, Ethiopia's highlands, or northeast India's hills, but in the imagination of all who carry their story. They are the unbroken hope of return, the scattered sparks of the people who refuse to let disappearance mean defeat. The search continues not because we cannot find them, but because we cannot stop needing them. 3,000 years ago, a people were taken from their land, marched across deserts, scattered into the machinery of an empire that no longer exists. By the logic of history, they should have disappeared. Names fade, languages die, customs blur and vanish. And yet, here we are still telling their story, still searching for them. That persistence is extraordinary. It says something not just about the Israelites, but about humanity itself. We hold on to what's gone, refusing to let the past disappear. We keep it alive with stories, memory, and prophecy. Sometimes that stubborn memory becomes real, as it did with Ethiopian Jews or the Bani Manasseh singing ancient songs of Zion in India. Modern science sharpens the picture. DNA testing confirms or denies connections that once lived only in rumor. Linguistics traces words through centuries. Archaeology shows who lived where and when. But even with all this, the story refuses to fade. Identity is not just blood, it's faith, belonging, and the stories people tell themselves about who they are. The 10 tribes may never be observed as explorers once dreamed, but they continue to inspire. For Jews, they remain a part of prophecy, a sign that history is still unfolding. For communities in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they provide a link to sacred ancestry, a declaration. We too are part of this eternal story. In Israel, the lost tribes are real people arriving on planes, applying for citizenship, learning Hebrew, reconnecting with a homeland they've never seen. Each arrival stitches a thread back into a torn garment, slowly, imperfectly, but stitched nonetheless. Beyond religion or politics, the legend of the lost tribes is the story of all of us. Every family, nation, and people have exiles, forgotten branches, and mysteries unsolved. Who among us does not carry a half-remembered story, a lost name, a homeland we will never walk again? The lost tribes endure. They are not just the story of Israel, they are humanity's longing for roots, for belonging, for return. When we speak of the 10 tribes, through the chants of the Bam and Ash, the rituals of the Lemba, the dreams of the Pashtuns, or the prayers of Jews at the Western Wall, we are speaking of hope itself, a hope that time cannot bury, a hope that exile cannot erase. A hope that what was scattered will one day be gathered again. That is the truest legacy of the 10 lost tribes. Not that they wait to be discovered, but that after nearly 3,000 years, they are still with us, not lost at all. The fire burns low now. We've walked deserts, followed rivers, crossed mountains, listened to voices carried through centuries, and still the tribes remain just out of reach, never quite seen, never completely gone. Perhaps that was always the way it was meant to be. The greatest stories do not end neatly, they linger, whispering questions long after the last word is spoken. The 10 lost tribes are a mirror. They reflect our longing to belong, our fear of being forgotten, and our hope that what is broken can be made whole again. And in that, they are not lost. They live in the prayers of the faithful, in songs of scattered peoples, and the curiosity of anyone who wonders where they came from. Perhaps one day, fragments will come together. Prophecies may find fulfillment. What was once scattered may be gathered. Until that day, whether tomorrow, in 1,000 years, or never we keep telling their story, we remember them, because in remembering, we refuse to let them vanish. Perhaps that is all they ever asked, to be remembered, to be part of the human story forever. So close your eyes and think of them, families taken long ago, children looking back at their homeland one last time. They are not truly lost. Not as long as someone somewhere still speaks their name. Our journey ends here, but the story goes on. A journey that began over 2,500 years ago, when Assyrian armies stormed the hills and valleys of ancient Israel, and 10 tribes, whole families, whole communities were carried away into the unknown. Since then, their names have never been forgotten. Reuben, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Each a thread in the tapestry of a people, each voice echoing across time, even if unseen. History offers no certainty. Were they absorbed into the Assyrian Empire, their identity fading with each generation? Or did some keep walking, leaving traces in Africa, Asia, and faraway lands, where memory turned to legend? No one can say for sure. And perhaps that is the story's power. Within the absence of answers, hope took root. A hope carried by exiles, prophets, and dreamers who believed that one day the lost would be gathered again. No matter how far they wandered, how deeply they vanished into time, they were never truly gone. This is why the story of the lost tribes matters not as a puzzle of history, but as a mirror to the human heart. We all know loss. We all know longing. Like those ancient tribes, we carry a yearning to return, to belong, to be found. Whisper their names, and we whisper our own fears and hopes. Even if history scatters us, even if time erases footprints, there is still a way back. There is still a chance that what is broken can be mended. The story of the Lost Tribes is not only about the past, it is about the present, about us, about resilience, about identity, about the faith that survives even when evidence fades. Perhaps one day the mystery will be solved. Until then, their story lives in every community that says their name, in every culture that refuses to forget, and in every heart that carries the quiet hope that nothing, truly nothing, is ever lost forever. The real power of the Lost Tribes lies not in being found on a map, but in never being erased from memory. Even when history leaves gaps, faith fills them with meaning. As we close this journey, hold on to that. In the vast silence of history, the Lost Tribes still speak not through ruins, not through records, but through the enduring story of survival, longing, and hope. And when we remember them, perhaps they are no longer lost at all. Thank you for walking this journey, for listening, for feeling the burden of history and the warmth of wonder. And remember, even in loss, there is always light. Nothing, no people, no story, no dream is ever truly gone.